So the next indirect use value that we're going to talk about is ecosystem productivity. And productivity is basically the same as biomass production. So what ecosystem services does productivity provide? Some examples are food for other organisms, soil formation, nutrient retention, carbon storage, and climate regulation, because plants pull carbon dioxide out of the air, and carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that traps heat in our atmosphere. And so we know that biodiversity is really important for ecosystem productivity. The University of Minnesota Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve has these really cool areas where some famous studies have been done. And Dr. David Tillman is a scientist that's been working on this sorts of research, and I've gotten to meet him. He does really interesting work. And basically, he works in these grasslands, and they manipulate the number of species in different grass plots, and then they measure all different things about these plots. But one of the things they've been measuring is ecosystem productivity. And what's really neat is you can actually see the difference. And so this shows on the left a treatment that has only one species of grass, and on the right is a treatment with 18 species of grass. And we tend to get much, much higher ecosystem productivity as we increase the number of species. It does plateau at some point where when you get to the higher number of species, adding one more species doesn't change the biomass very much. But when you start at the bottom at like one or two species, every time you add a new species, it increases the ecosystem productivity quite a bit. So you can see here higher productivity, higher biomass in the plots with more species. This shows this in a graph, and so this is David Tillman's famous research from 1997. And we can see that we increase the number of species present here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis it shows the percent of the surface area covered by plants. And we see that there's low plant cover with only a few species, and then it increases, and then it approaches a maximum value as we get to 55 species. So that's a lot of biodiversity. So we can imagine that this really illustrates the importance of biodiversity, because we can get so much more biomass as we increase the number of species in an ecosystem. They've also shown other things besides just biomass. They found that when you increase the plant diversity, which increases the biomass, that those areas tolerate drought better. They resist invasion by non-native species, and they support a greater diversity of insects. So in general, it looks like increasing the diversity of plants increases ecosystem function in a variety of different ways. We also know that ecosystem productivity increases the capacity for forests to hold on to carbon. And this is one of the reasons that paying to protect forests is an important part of our climate change solutions. And so they do carbon offsets, which is basically where you're paid to keep carbon in an ecosystem. And so productive forests that have high biodiversity are important as part of this solution to climate change and climate regulation through the productivity of the ecosystem. So the next type of indirect use all have to do with species relationships. And we often think of ecosystem services as dealing with plants, but animals provide us a lot of ecosystem services as well. So 35% of our world crop production needs pollinators. And pollinators can increase the outputs of crops by 87%. That's a lot. So you can imagine how much less productive some of our agriculture would be without pollinators. They've estimated that the benefits of pollinators is about $200 billion annually. So that's a lot of value that we get from having pollinators. So as I mentioned, the productivity of some of our crops increases with pollination. And so this graph shows wild bee visitation rates on the x-axis and the percent fruit set. So that's the percent of flowers that actually turn into fruit on a plant. And so you can imagine that more fruit is going to mean better production from an agricultural perspective. And so we see with more wild bee visitation rates, we get more fruit set for our crops. And then you can actually see the difference in some of the crops. So some plants can self, which means that from their own plant, they can use the pollen to fertilize the ovules in order to produce a fruit, whereas some can get their pollen or have to have their pollen from other individual plants. And they won't make a good fruit, or sometimes they won't make a fruit at all without pollen from another plant. And so you can see here for strawberries on the left shows an example of a strawberry from cross-pollination. So that means that an insect brought pollen from another plant to that plant in order to make that strawberry. But if they self or have just wind pollination, you get these wonky small strawberries that nobody's really going to want to eat. So this shows how important pollination is for strawberries. And this just shows a list of different crops that we need wild pollinators for. And some of the tropical things need bats. So like I believe the agave plants that they use to make tequila are actually bat pollinated. So we need those kinds of pollinators for some things. Some things are pollinated by birds. Some things are pollinated by bees or wasps or moths. But we have a huge number of different fruits that rely on these wild pollinators. So another type of species relationship that's important for agriculture and just for our comfort is predators of insects provide really important pest control. And so these could be pests on our crops. They could also be pests that we just don't want to deal with. Like mosquitoes. And so there's lots of birds and predator insects that are important for regulating the number of kind of nuisance or disease vector like mosquitoes. And there's quite a few others that are also really important for eating pests on our crop species. And we're finding more and more that having these predators available is important for disease control because a lot of pests carry different pathogens, and having biodiversity is important for reducing the amount of disease-carrying animals and insects that could harm people. One really cool example is bats. And so I don't know if any of you have ever been to San Antonio or Austin. There are free-tailed bats underneath the bridges. And you can go to this place in Austin. I think you can in San Antonio. I've only done it in Austin. But you can go out in the summer and stand on this bridge and just see loads and loads and loads of bats coming out from under the bridge. They roost underneath this bridge over the river. And you can just see them flowing out through the air in these waves. And those bats eat tons of insects every night. And they've actually done studies and found that these free-tailed bats can eat half their weight in moths every night. And a lot of moths are really important agricultural pests. And so they've actually found that the presence of these bats is really important for crop production around those areas in Texas. So around San Antonio, Texas, they've done these estimates and they found that these bats saved cotton farmers $741,000 a year in pesticides. And that's in pesticides, so that means there's less chemicals being sprayed if we're preserving these animals And we get all these services just by having a bridge over the river. Other species relationships are also important for crops. And a lot of these have to do with these important symbiotic relationships between or with fungi and bacteria and crops that we have. And so fungi make these relationships with roots of different plants and help them absorb water and nutrients, and the plant will then give the fungi carbohydrates. So some of the sugars it makes from photosynthesis go to the fungi, and the fungi helps get more nutrients for the plant so that it can do photosynthesis more effectively. There are also bacteria that form these root nodules, which you can see on this picture on the right. And these help fix nitrogen. So most of the nitrogen on planet Earth is in the form of air, and it is N2, and it has a triple bond, and it's really hard to break. So it's very hard to get all this nitrogen that's in the air into a usable form for plants. And these bacteria can actually do that. And so they make this special relationship with plants where they get a place to live in the root tissue, and they also get sugars from the plant. But the bacteria will turn nitrogen gas into a usable form of nitrogen, and it's called nitrogen fixation. And a lot of our legumes do that. So things like soybeans, the reason we do crop rotation between corn and soybeans is because these bacteria have this relationship with soybeans and allow them to pull nitrogen out of the air and make it into a usable form. And some of that nitrogen ends up in the soil, which then if we rotate the crops to corn, that nitrogen is more available in the soil when we have corn, and corn doesn't have this special relationship. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and the next video will be on